brash Midwestern city still recovering from the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris had just finished, and America was humiliated with its sad jumble of shops, booths, and bazaars that were often unpleasing in themselves and incongruous when taken together. America had hoped that France's exhibits would fail, particularly Gustave Eiffel's Tower. However, France's displays were a huge success, especially the Eiffel Tower. Because of this utter failure in Paris, America was desperate to prove itself. Our nation needed something, anything to top the French. The 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus discovering the Americas was approaching, and that presented the perfect opportunity, a World's Fair to be hosted in America. But where? At first, many Americans thought that the best place to host a fair would be in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. In fact, even many Chicagoans agreed. Soon, however, other cities, including New York and St. Louis, wanted to host the fair. Then Chicago began to ask, why not us? So then Chicago identified a committee that consisted of 250 of its most prominent men to help get the fair to come to Chicago. Everyone in Chicago was hungry for the fair, but Congress still had the final say. The big vote was approaching. When the vote finally took place, New York City and Chicago were the two frontrunners, simply because each city had the ability to raise large sums of money. St. Louis and Washington, D.C. never really stood a chance, and that showed when both cities didn't even come slightly close to a majority. In the end, Chicago beat out New York City by a majority of 157 to 72 votes, meaning that Chicago got to host the fair. Preparations would begin immediately. The first order of business was to decide where to construct the buildings. Daniel Burnham and John Root were appointed leaders of organizing the fair. Then, disaster struck.
Unfortunately, Root, who was the designer of the two, whereas Burnham was more the planner and the business guy and the person who went out and got the commissions. Anyway, Root, bidding farewell to some of the New York architects on a cold January night in 1891, caught pneumonia and died within just a couple of days. And this left Burnham with this enormous responsibility of planning this thing that just had an impossible time frame, and now he was without a designer. And so he began calling in the New York, the famous architects from around the country to help him with the project.
During the construction of the fair, Daniel Burnham was kind and compassionate towards the thousands upon thousands of people working to construct the fair before it had to open in May of 1893. However, Burnham could be quite merciless when he thought that someone was not doing the job they were supposed to do. This was one of the main factors that came into play when the man in charge of painting all the buildings was dismissed quickly and without much ceremony. So instead, they decided to simply paint all the buildings white. They came up with a creative and inventive idea to create a spray painting mechanism to paint all the buildings white, and thus causing the fair to be the first event of any size to be spray painted. This is also where the name White City came from. Another aspect of planning the fair was the landscaping. Burnham brought in Frederick Law Olmsted to help him with this task. They had in mind this combination of quite formal outdoor areas, followed by a more natural landscape. The formal area included plazas that would have perfectly symmetrical buildings on both sides, or a column that was dead center on axis as a fairgoer would look down the lagoon, and then there were many other features like this. Then, as the fairgoer would go further into the grounds, they would see much more natural landscape, like the wooded island, and the natural-looking lagoon that surrounded it. Essentially, the fair was organized so that one would go from the orderly section, and then they would walk on to see the sublime beauty of nature. In almost the blink of an eye, it was May of 1893 and it was time for the fair to open. Almost 250,000 people flocked to see the fair on opening day, thus making it appear to be on track to become a record-breaking event. However, the first ever Ferris wheel was debuting at the fair, and it wasn't finished on opening day. Despite the huge success on that day, the next month had attendance rates that were astoundingly low, and instead of looking like a huge success, the fair began to look like it was going to become an epic failure. Soon, however, attendance rates began to pick up, and the legacy of the fair was forming.
So 22 million people came to see that fair. Now, the population of the United States at the time was only 61 million, so that's a pretty impressive number. A lot of people came more than once. It's not like 1 out of every 3 people in the country came. But anyway, 22 million people came to see the fair. and they were really impressed with what they saw, because here was this work of architecture and landscaping integrated in a beautiful way that had really not been seen anywhere except the grand palaces of Europe. Certainly had never been seen in North America before. And here was electric lighting at night. The fairgrounds were lit using more electricity than the whole city of New York had at the time in 1893. Here was a place where there were no beggars in the streets. There was no horse manure everywhere you stepped. It was clean, it was orderly, it was beautiful, and everything was just organized so handsomely. And so this, I think it's safe to say, awakened an interest in Americans and sort of led to what we call the City Beautiful movement. So people went back home and said, why can't our city have some of the beauty that we saw at the White City in Chicago? And so they began calling for architects to prepare city plans for them. Burnham himself starts to get these commissions to actually prepare such plans based on his fame at the World's Fair. And parks and parkway systems start getting laid out in Kansas City and Dallas.
The fair ended with a twist. Mayor Carter Harrison was assassinated by Patrick Eugene Prendergast just before the closing ceremony, so instead of a massive grand closing ceremony, there was a funeral. Mayor Carter Harrison was Chicago's first 5-time elected mayor, so it was especially sad when he was assassinated because the entire city of Chicago loved him. The fair pushed Chicago into a whole different league among cities in North America and around the world. Before the fair, Chicago was very much of an upstart city that Europeans sneered at because it had made all of its money off of farm implements and slaughtering pigs. It had a reputation of being dirty, money-loving, and the fair completely changed that impression. People began to think of it as a whole different kind of place. It was on the same level as Philadelphia and Boston, if not New York City. It became one of the premier cities in North America and would never be overlooked again.
Within just a couple of years after the fair closed, he is now in demand as a planner of things as large as entire cities. So Olmsted brings him in to work on the replanning of Washington, D.C. So what we now think of as the monumental core of Washington, the mall, the monuments that are around it, those didn't exist in 1900. And the Macmillan Plan created this idea that this is where we should put new memorials, this is how it should be landscaped in this extremely formal manner. So Burnham is a part of that. He's sent to the Philippines to create their new capital at Baguio. He works on the group plan for Cleveland. He finishes a plan for the city of San Francisco. And the boxes of books are delivered to City Hall just in time for the earthquake and fire in April 1906. And so in the wake of the fire that's destroyed all of San Francisco, nobody is going to bother to replan a bunch of streets to turn them into parkways or to create a bunch of new parks everywhere. They're so bent on rebuilding the city as fast as they can that Burnham knows it's lost. So Chicago's on his mind, and he comes back to Chicago and begins work on the plan of Chicago.